When police arrived at the crime scene, they found two 17-year-old identical twin brothers covered in blood, both pointing fingers at each other, both claiming innocence, both telling investigators that the other one had committed the murder. For months, prosecutors faced an impossible puzzle. How do you prove which twin is guilty when their DNA is virtually identical, when their fingerprints are nearly indistinguishable, when even their own parents can barely tell them apart? The answer would come from a microscopic fragment of evidence so small it was almost missed, a single piece of biological material that would finally expose which brother had taken a life and which had watched it happen. Jacob and Ryan Walsh were born 3 minutes apart on a cold February morning in Minneapolis, Minnesota, entering the world as mirror images of each other in almost every way. They shared the same bright blue eyes, the same sandy blonde hair, the same scattering of freckles across their noses, and as they grew, they developed the same lean, athletic build that made them standout players on their high school basketball team. To strangers, they were indistinguishable, two versions of the same person moving through the world in perfect synchronization. But to those who knew them well, the differences were profound and disturbing. Jacob was the older twin by those 3 minutes, and he had spent his entire life wielding that technicality like a crown. He was charismatic, confident to the point of arrogance, the twin who spoke first in every conversation, who made decisions for both of them, who had always been the leader in their symbiotic relationship. Ryan, by contrast, was quieter, more thoughtful, content to exist in his brother's shadow, to follow Jacob's lead, to be the loyal second to his brother's dominant first. Their parents, Tom and Linda Walsh, had always dismissed concerns about their dynamic as typical twin behavior, never recognizing the subtle toxicity of a relationship where one twin controlled and the other complied. The brothers were seniors at Roosevelt High School in suburban Minneapolis, popular enough to be known but not so prominent as to draw intense scrutiny. They had a tight circle of friends, played basketball competitively, and maintained solid B averages without much effort. To the outside world, they were normal teenage boys navigating the final year of high school together. But beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary lives, a darkness had been growing, fed by jealousy, resentment, and a toxic codependency that was about to explode into violence. The victim was Marcus Chen, an 18-year-old senior who had been a fixture at Roosevelt High since freshman year. Marcus was everything the Walsh twins were not: effortlessly brilliant, genuinely kind, and independently confident without needing to dominate anyone. He was the valedictorian, captain of the debate team, and had recently been accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship. But what made Marcus a target in Jacob's mind was not his success, but his relationship with a girl named Emma Rodriguez, a junior who had been the object of Jacob's obsessive interest for months. Emma had made it clear she was not interested in Jacob, politely declining his advances multiple times before finally telling him directly to leave him alone. But instead of accepting rejection, Jacob had become fixated, his interest morphing into something darker and more possessive. When Emma started dating Marcus in early March, Jacob's resentment crystallized into pure hatred. He began spreading rumors about Marcus, making subtle threats, and pulling Ryan deeper into his spiral of rage. Ryan, as always, followed his brother's lead, absorbing Jacob's hatred as if it were his own, unable or unwilling to break free from the toxic dynamic that had defined their entire lives. The murder occurred on a Friday night in late April, during a party at the home of a classmate whose parents were out of town. The house was packed with students, music pounding, alcohol flowing freely in the way it does at unsupervised teenage gatherings. Marcus had arrived with Emma, and the sight of them together, laughing and comfortable in each other's presence, had sent Jacob into a barely contained fury. He spent the evening drinking heavily, his eyes tracking Marcus's every move, his rage building with each passing hour. Ryan stayed close to his brother, recognizing the dangerous energy radiating from Jacob, but saying nothing, doing nothing to intervene. Around 11:30 p.m., Marcus stepped outside to take a phone call, walking to the far end of the backyard where the noise from the party was muted enough for conversation. It was dark beyond the reach of the porch lights, the shadows deep and concealing. Security camera footage from a neighboring house would later show two figures following Marcus into that darkness, their identical silhouettes moving in tandem, but the poor quality of the video made it impossible to identify specific features or actions. What happened in those shadows would become the subject of intense legal debate, but the outcome was horrifyingly clear. Marcus Chen was attacked with brutal, overwhelming force. He was struck repeatedly with a metal baseball bat that belonged to the Walsh twins, the blows targeting his head and torso with an intensity that spoke of pure rage rather than simple violence. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but in that brief window, Marcus suffered catastrophic injuries: a fractured skull, broken ribs, collapsed lung, and massive internal bleeding. He died at the scene, his body discovered 20 minutes later by a partygoer who had stepped outside for air and stumbled upon the horrific tableau. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Students screamed, someone called 911, and within minutes, police and paramedics descended on the scene. Officers began separating witnesses, trying to establish who had been where and when. And that's when they found Jacob and Ryan Walsh sitting together on the back steps of the house, both of them with blood spattered on their clothes and hands, both of them visibly shaken, and both of them immediately pointing at the other and saying the same thing. He did it, not me. He killed Marcus.
Detective Sarah Morrison, the lead investigator, had seen many things in her 20 years with the Minneapolis Police Department, but this was something entirely new. She had two suspects who were genetically nearly identical, both present at the murder scene, both covered in the victim's blood, and both accusing the other of the actual killing. Standard forensic evidence that would normally identify a killer, DNA from blood or skin cells, fingerprints on the weapon, was virtually useless when dealing with identical twins whose biological markers were almost indistinguishable. Both twins were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Both immediately lawyered up, Jacob with a private attorney his parents scraped their savings to afford, and Ryan with a court-appointed public defender. And both maintained the same story with remarkable consistency. They had both been present when Marcus was attacked, but only one of them had actually committed the murder, and each claimed it was the other. Jacob insisted that Ryan had grabbed the bat and attacked Marcus in a sudden rage, that he had tried to stop his brother but failed. Ryan, in a mirror narrative, claimed that Jacob had been the one wielding the bat, that he had been frozen in shock and fear, unable to intervene. The legal challenge was unprecedented. Hennepin County Prosecutor James Mitchell knew that without being able to definitively prove which twin had struck the fatal blows, he risked both brothers walking free or receiving lesser charges than the evidence warranted. The case became a forensic nightmare, with experts from across the country consulted on the possibilities of distinguishing between identical twins through biological evidence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dr. Elena Vazquez, a forensic biologist specializing in trace evidence, who had been consulting on the case. While examining the victim's body with microscopic detail, she discovered something that had been initially overlooked in the standard autopsy. Under two Marcus Chen's fingernails, embedded in the tissue where he had clearly fought back against his attacker, were minute fragments of skin and epithelial cells. Standard DNA testing on these samples would show they matched the Walsh twins, but Dr. Vazquez proposed something more sophisticated: epigenetic analysis. Epigenetics studies the chemical modifications to DNA that control gene expression without changing the underlying genetic code. These modifications are influenced by environmental factors, lifestyle, even stress levels, and they differ between individuals, including identical twins. As twins age and experience life differently, their epigenetic markers begin to diverge, creating a unique signature that can distinguish one twin from another. It was cutting-edge science, barely established in criminal proceedings, but it represented the only hope of determining which brother had actually killed Marcus Chen. The samples were sent to a specialized laboratory in Boston that had pioneered epigenetic analysis in forensic contexts. The process took 3 months, an agonizing period during which both twins remained in custody, both maintaining their accusations against the other, both seemingly prepared to let the other take the fall for murder. The results, when they finally arrived, were unequivocal and damning. The skin cells under Marcus Chen's fingernails belonged to Jacob Walsh, not Ryan. The implications were staggering. Marcus had fought back against his attacker, had managed in his final moments to claw at the person beating him to death, and in doing so, had trapped biological evidence that would eventually identify his killer. Jacob Walsh had been the one wielding the bat, had been the one delivering the fatal blows, and Ryan had been present but not actively participating in the murder itself. Armed with this evidence, Prosecutor Mitchell restructured his case. Jacob Walsh would be tried for first-degree murder, while Ryan would face charges as an accessory to murder for his presence and failure to intervene or seek help. The distinction was crucial. Jacob faced life in prison without parole, while Ryan's charge carried a significantly lesser sentence. Jacob's defense attorney, Michael Brennan, immediately challenged the epigenetic evidence, arguing it was too novel, too untested to be admissible in court. He filed multiple motions to exclude the evidence, bringing in experts who testified about the limitations and potential errors in epigenetic analysis. The legal battle over the admissibility of this evidence took months, with Judge Catherine O'Brien eventually ruling that the science was sufficiently established and reliable to be presented to a jury, setting a precedent that would impact future cases nationwide. The trial of Jacob Walsh began on a cold January morning, 9 months after Marcus Chen's murder. The courtroom was packed with students from Roosevelt High, Marcus's grieving family, and media representatives, covering what had become a landmark case in forensic science. Jacob sat at the defense table, his face a carefully composed mask of innocence and wounded dignity. In the gallery, under guard and awaiting his own trial, sat Ryan, watching his twin brother with an expression that was impossible to read. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the evidence of Jacob's obsession with Emma Rodriguez, testimony from students who had heard his threats against Marcus, and the timeline of events from the party. They showed the security camera footage of 2 figures following Marcus into the darkness, and they walked the jury through the horrific details of the attack itself. But the centerpiece of their case was Dr. Vasquez and the epigenetic evidence. Dr. Vasquez spent an entire day on the stand explaining in clear, accessible terms how epigenetic markers work, how they differ between individuals, and how the analysis of the skin cells under Marcus Chen's fingernails had definitively identified Jacob as the source. She brought visual aids, charts, and peer-reviewed studies supporting the validity of the technique. Under cross-examination by Brennan, she remained unshakable, calmly addressing every challenge to her methodology and conclusions. The moment that truly sealed Jacob's fate came when the prosecution played a recording of a phone call Jacob had made from jail to a friend, a call that had been monitored and recorded as per standard procedures. In it, Jacob could be heard saying, "The DNA thing is bullshit. They can't prove anything. Ryan better keep his mouth shut or we're both screwed." This statement revealed Jacob's consciousness of guilt, his belief that silence and mutual accusation were his best defense, and his expectation that Ryan would continue to play his assigned role as the loyal twin. But Ryan Walsh had undergone a transformation during the months since Marcus's death. Separated from his brother for the first time in his life, in therapy mandated by his public defender, he had begun to unpack the toxic dynamic that had controlled his entire existence. He had started to see how Jacob had dominated him, manipulated him, pulled him into darkness that he had never wanted but had been too conditioned to resist. And when the prosecution offered him a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against Jacob, Ryan made a choice that would break the final bond between the twins. He agreed to testify. The courtroom fell into stunned silence when Ryan Walsh was called as a witness for the prosecution. Jacob, at the defense table, went rigid, his eyes locked on his brother with an intensity that seemed to physically cross the space between them. Ryan walked to the witness stand without looking at Jacob, his face pale but determined, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. Prosecutor Mittel approached him gently, understanding the magnitude of what Ryan was about to do. "Ryan, can you tell the jury what happened the night Marcus Chen was murdered?"
Ryan took a deep breath, and then, in a quiet but steady voice, he began to speak. He described Jacob's obsession with Emma, his escalating rage at Marcus, his drinking at the party. He recounted how Jacob had convinced him to follow Marcus outside, how Jacob had retrieved the baseball bat from his car beforehand, how Jacob had told him, "I'm going to teach that prick a lesson." "What happened when you reached Marcus in the backyard?" Mitchell asked. Ryan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Jacob attacked him. Marcus didn't even see it coming. Jacob just started hitting him with the bat, over and over. Marcus tried to fight back, tried to grab the bat, and he scratched at Jacob's arms, his face. But Jacob kept hitting him until Marcus stopped moving." "What did you do during the attack?" "Nothing." Ryan's voice cracked. "I stood there and I did nothing. I was scared. I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. And when it was over, when Marcus was on the ground and Jacob dropped the bat, Jacob looked at me and said, 'If anyone asks, we both did it, and we blame each other. They can't prove which one of us it was.' And I believed him. I believed that's what we had to do." "Why are you testifying now, Ryan?" Ryan finally looked at Jacob, meeting his brother's eyes for the first time since taking the stand. "Because Marcus Chen was a good person who didn't deserve to die. Because Jacob murdered him out of jealousy and rage, and because I'm done protecting my brother from the consequences of what he's done. I'm done being controlled by him. I'm done being his shadow." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Jacob's face had transformed from shock to pure, incandescent rage. He lunged forward in his seat, restrained by bailiffs, shouting, "You traitor! You're lying! We made a deal!" The outburst only confirmed what Ryan had just testified, the existence of their pact to blame each other, the conspiracy to obstruct justice. Judge O'Brien restored order, but the damage to Jacob's defense was catastrophic and irreversible. His own brother had just provided a detailed eyewitness account of the murder, corroborating the physical evidence, explaining the circumstances, and, most devastatingly, revealing Jacob's plan to use their identical appearance as a shield against prosecution. The defense attempted to salvage the case by arguing that Ryan was lying to save himself, that his testimony was bought with a plea deal. But the combination of Ryan's testimony, the epigenetic evidence, and Jacob's own recorded statements created an overwhelming case. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts: first-degree murder, assault, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Marcus Chen's parents delivered victim impact statements that reduced the courtroom to tears. They spoke of their son's dreams, his kindness, his brilliant future stolen by senseless violence. They looked directly at Jacob Walsh and asked the question that had haunted everyone: why? What did our son do to deserve this, except exist and be happy? Jacob, given the opportunity to speak, showed no remorse. He said, "My brother is a liar. This whole trial is a joke. That DNA evidence is garbage science. You're convicting me because you need someone to blame, and it's easier to believe the twin who made a deal than the one who's telling the truth." Judge O'Brien's sentencing remarks were pointed and severe. "Mr. Walsh, you murdered an innocent young man out of jealousy and entitlement. You attempted to use your genetic relationship with your brother as a shield, expecting that reasonable doubt would set you both free. But science and your brother's conscience have exposed the truth. You are a killer, and you will be held accountable." Jacob Walsh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As bailiffs led him from the courtroom, he turned one final time to look at Ryan, who sat in the gallery. The look that passed between them was the death of a bond that had existed before birth, the final severing of a connection that had survived 17 years, only to be destroyed by violence, lies, and the courage of one twin to finally break free. Ryan Walsh, as part of his plea agreement, was sentenced to 8 years in prison as an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. He would be eligible for parole in 5 years, with credit for time served. His sentence acknowledged his presence and failure to intervene or report the crime, but also recognized his ultimate choice to tell the truth, a choice that had likely prevented both brothers from escaping justice entirely. The case set a significant legal precedent, establishing epigenetic analysis as a viable forensic tool for distinguishing between identical twins in criminal cases. It would be cited in future cases across the country, providing a solution to what had previously been an almost insurmountable prosecutorial challenge. For Emma Rodriguez, who had been pulled into a nightmare not of her making, the trial brought a measure of closure, but also lasting trauma. She testified about Jacob's obsessive behavior, and she had to live with the knowledge that Marcus had died because Jacob couldn't accept her choice. She would eventually leave Minneapolis for college, seeking distance from the memories and the weight of survivors' guilt. For the Chen family, no verdict could bring back their son, but the knowledge that his killer had been identified and punished provided some small comfort in their grief. They established a scholarship in Marcus's name at Roosevelt High School, ensuring that his legacy would be one of achievement and kindness, rather than being defined by the violence that ended his life. And for Ryan Walsh, sitting in his cell, separated from his brother for the first time since birth, the future was a blank canvas of possibility and regret. He had finally broken free from Jacob's control, but the price had been his participation in a murder and his testimony against his own twin. He would spend the next years in therapy, in education, working to understand how their relationship had become so toxic and how he might eventually build a life defined by his own choices rather than his brother's dominance.
The story of Jacob and Ryan Walsh became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that family bonds, even the sacred connection between twins, are not immune to toxicity, and that loyalty becomes complicity when it shields evil from consequence. The microscopic evidence under Marcus Chen's fingernails had not only solved a murder, but it also severed a bond between brothers, proving that even the most identical of twins can make choices that define them as wholly different people.